inviting me. I've never been to Indiana before. This is really neat for me. And I appreciate you coming out to this talk to learn about container security. I'm pretty excited because it was originally a lot more sanitized, but I just started my own company, so I don't really need to worry about pissing off Google or anyone, or kind of presenting in that sort of way. So you're going to get the first version of this where, you know, I kind of tear into Google a little bit, and I think they deserve it. And I thought that's also what you'd want to see, because that's what's true. So as I go through the talk, I kind of like to know where people are at in terms of how much you know about containers or container security. Just a show of hands, has anyone here set up Docker or Kubernetes? All right, cool. So for the most part, people have a pretty high level of comfort. Anyone here who is new, came here to kind of learn about it? Okay, that's a decent number of folks too. All right, I think we can make this work for everyone. So you are at Containers, Exploits, Surprises, and Security with me. Hashtag, I believe, is CircleCityCon, yes? And you are welcome to tag me on Twitter or on Facebook, or quote me or whatever. I'm a private person in some respects, but not when I'm on stage, not here and not with this. So if you think something is useful or you want to share it, I appreciate that. Mark Andreessen famously said software is eating the world in 2011, and at the time that seemed kind of true and wise. And now it's more like containers are eating software. But actually it's more like Monero miners are eating the containers. And we'll dig into that as we go through the presentation. So what is Docker? Docker claims to be the world's leading software containerization platform. All right? And their promise, among other things, is security. In theory, that's part of what's really useful about containers, is you get like this really cool way to do defense in depth. They promise to deliver applications safer across the entire lifecycle with built-in security capabilities and configurations out of the box. That makes you think that you don't need to do extra configuration, right? Like just set it up and go and we're good. So when people are misconfiguring their containers, I don't really think it's their fault when the marketing looks like this. But I'm just imagining like the marketing people writing things without any relationship to like the tech team or the product team or like what actual capabilities are. And actually, if any of you have ever worked in marketing, that's pretty true. I'm in marketing. The accountability and the feedback loop is not what it should be. Configurations out of the box. And I had more to say about Docker, but I just came back from KubeCon in Copenhagen, which is the Kubernetes event. And one of my realizations there, part of what people were talking about, is that Docker Inc. is actually dead. So I plan to come here and talk to you about Docker vulnerabilities and Docker exploits, but I don't know if anyone really cares. Of course, it's certainly interesting as hackers to kind of know where things are going, if things are not going to be as well maintained in the future, if leadership isn't there. It could mean a certain, opening for that sort of thing, but one of the founders just left, and they don't really have a business model now that Kubernetes has come in and kind of eaten their lunch. So we're going to focus a little more on Kubernetes because that's what's taking over the container space. Kubernetes also claims to be the industry leading, except I think they're correct, industry leading open source container orchestrator which powers Kubernetes engine. And in theory, it's really good, right? Like here's a diagram of how the isolation works, and in theory you get this great defense in depth. Also, I'm just kind of making the point that Kubernetes matters. I'll go through this pretty quickly. Google Cloud is making the claim that containers is the Google way. From Gmail to YouTube to search, everything at Google runs in containers. That's like a startling number. Something like each week we start over 2 billion containers. So containers are really, really big. That's why I'm doing this talk now. I'm actually new to containers, so I'm mostly sharing these like cool, neat things that I've discovered with you, who, you know, many of you are going to have more expertise in different ways, or at the least your own time to kind of play with this stuff. So I'm sharing what I'm learning and kind of hoping it'll be interesting to you and that you'll go off and poke holes at them, because they need that. Also because it's fun. So yeah, there are fancy exploits. And when I originally started thinking about this talk, I thought that's what this would be about. And you kind of hope that that's where things are going to be. Like, you hope that you're going to have to work kind of hard and be like, you know, a cat on a unicorn to make things go. But no. It's really about good old misconfiguration. And the core Kubernetes team calls many security issues misconfiguration. But what do you call it when misconfiguration is the default? And when the engineers all know that that's how it is. And everyone just decides that that's what it's going to be. So Kubernetes has so many fun attack vectors, many of which are intentionally enabled by default because I love trash. Or maybe it's not quite that, but that's certainly what it looks like from a security lens. So I'm going to show you why I've come to this conclusion. Hacking Kubernetes. So we're used to taking strong measures to protect user data, but what about keeping hackers away from those S3 buckets? Here's an example. Someone on Twitter found hackers fighting over the clusters. Like, there are too many people who've gotten into the same one and they're fighting over it. And raise your hand, has anyone here heard about the Tesla hack? Okay, so if you're like really following, yeah, right, you're smiling, because it's just so bad. So if you're following Kubernetes closely, this was like really big news because Tesla's such a major brand, and they were pwned in just like the stupidest way. So this is like the new famous example of a Kubernetes vulnerability. So the hack is that Monero miners infiltrated a Kubernetes console, which was not password protected, and there were access credentials, which gave them access to AWS. Now this bucket had sensitive data, and they didn't care, because they just wanted those, you know, sweet, sweet altcoins. Monero is a like privacy altcoin. So the hackers did some smart things. They hid their IP address behind Cloudflare. They were on a non-standard port, and also they kept their CPU usage low, you know, helps evade detection. So there are various lessons from this, which I think are not really like lessons to a group of security people, but I posted them anyway. Now I'm going to show you one more. This exploit is really like a good example of the security mindset of the Kubernetes team. The GitHub comments are interesting. So you had a single node Kubernetes deployment running on top of Alpine Linux. Alexander Ursioli from Handy wrote up a cool Medium article about this. This was a coworker of his, had his like personal Kubernetes. So they all saw this happening like at the team at Handy, but it wasn't a Handy cluster. It was just an employee running something personal. And there was the indication of compromise. And then curling the endpoints leads to mining proxy online. And they were able to actually see the Monero mining script. And it was like, well, how did this happen? So the Kubernetes API server was publicly exposed to the internet, but it was protected. But by default, there was this insecure way that things were structured, even though people had been filing bug reports since 2015, namely where you could just use the username of system anonymous and a group of system unauthenticated, and you get in, which is terrible. Here's just some more details about how this bug used to work. Now here you see that they finally closed it. So this issue has finally been closed after being open since 2015. And someone says, is there any CVE for this? This is before they closed it. People are like, this is a problem. No. Running in production, without enabling kubelet authn auths is a misconfiguration, not a CVE. And this was from Jordan, and you'll see his organizations. He's part of Google Cloud and part of Kubernetes. And so you had, Google, Kubernetes, like core members, seeing these bug reports coming in and saying, look, this isn't a vulnerability. The user just needs to configure it differently. But when you've got, hundreds and thousands of people with these misconfigurations, I think the responsibility is to come back onto Google to, try and protect them and try and make it easier for people to do their setups. As you can see, I'm salty about this. We're security professionals. We don't want to see a company as big as Google with all of those resources being neglectful in this way. Now, the reason why they've been doing things this way is because of backwards compatibility, among other reasons. But, the security vulnerabilities are bad. All right, so exploiting Kubernetes. They do have a disclosure process. Here are some tools that I thought would be interesting. So you can go into Kubernetes on Shodan, and you get some very interesting results. Most people here, you've been on Shodan, yeah? Yeah. Just shodan.io. It's not very expensive. So you can try this at home if you want. You can get all kinds of credentials because there's just so much that's actually exposed to the public internet, which is not really surprising, but I had to double check this a few times because I didn't think that it was real, but the HTTP service on 2379 TCP is the default, and it is accessible and not secured by default. You will get passwords, AWS keys, and such. And from the website themselves, they talk here about how authentication was added, but previously it was a completely open system, and the feature is off by default for backwards compatibility. Same here. By default, unauthenticated access. Here's some common vulnerabilities to look for on Shodan, and a fun Medium post with more details on it. As I said, a lot of what I've done here is kind of found some neat things and wanted to share it with everyone. But they're not all things that I found myself. This is also a list of some of the tools. I spent a long time trying to figure out which tools were actually good. So Docker has made some tools for Docker, but Docker isn't as important anymore. So I think that the tools for Kubernetes are a lot more important, a lot more interesting. You've got kubebench, and that checks Kubernetes against the CIS Kubernetes benchmarks. Now, the CIS Kubernetes benchmarks are really, really good as a guideline for hardening Kubernetes. The problem is, and this is what it looks like. The problem is that it's just so long. It's like pages and pages and pages. So we really need someone to write like a TLDR guide. And hopefully we'll start to see that soon. There are some security experts in the container space, and they're writing books. So within the next year, hopefully we'll get a bit of an easier how-to guide, because the CIS benchmarks are really, really dense. Also, Heptio is a really good company in the space founded by one of the Kubernetes founders. And they make some really useful tools. They make a configuration management tool because misconfiguration is such a common problem. So I would recommend that one. Yeah, here we go. Sorry for the misorder here. You see it's like 259 pages with the CIS benchmarks for Kubernetes. It's just really, really difficult to get this right. I think one way to handle this is to use some kind of managed service. Like you can use, Microsoft has a managed service. Microsoft is reasonable for enterprise type security things. But basically, like Kubernetes is really hard to configure and it's a problem. Highlights, enable built-in Linux security measures, SE Linux, SEComp profiles. And that gives you a little more fine-grained control, but again, you have to be able to understand what to do with the fine-grained control. Also, vulnerability scanning by Google. My recommendation in general is the tools by Heptio and by Google. Those are the best from what I can tell. Also Grapheus. So this one is for auditing your supply chain, which is useful because you need to know that there aren't vulnerabilities inside your containers. So I have a bunch of other slides, but I wanted to leave it on this one because this is my favorite. And I tend to be a little informal with talks that are, there we go. You can still hear me okay? With talks that are like, you said, that was saying yes? Okay, cool, thank you. So, because this is a community, it's like a community hacker event. And so I didn't necessarily want it to be like all me on stage. I figured there are going to be people in the room who have some interesting experiences, and I'd want to open it up, especially because it's the end of the day, right? Like it's been a long day already. If anyone here has some interesting stories about container vulnerabilities or container security, I thought I'd mix it up a bit. I'd love to hear someone from the audience. Yeah, in the back.
I have a small plug for something that you guys can look at if you're looking at computers. VMware has something called Turn that we just released not too long ago. VMware's Turn is an open source compliance tool for auditing containers. So it generates a bill of materials for all of the different software packages that went into generating that container. So then you can check that against, open source libraries and programs to make sure your container is not vulnerable.
What was it called again?
It's called Turn, like the bird, T-E-R-N. It's on GitHub.
I met one of the executives from VMware at KubeCon, and he was really, really, really smart.
Which one?
Don't remember his name.
Is it Dirk?
No, we can just
okay.
move on from that.
All right.
Does anyone else have anything that you've seen with container vulnerabilities or exploits or security? Thought I saw a hand before. Yeah.
A lot of things are possible to secure, but it's in this misconfiguration. It's in the speed of getting it up. It's like, well, when you're running container, you should do things like GoSu and other things to make sure that it's not running as root in case there's an underlying kernel vulnerability. And Kubernetes itself is a beast, and you can, if you disregard all the security, you can get it set up fairly easy, but getting all the dials just right can be complex, and you are seeing more people going, well, the solution is to just go ahead and use the hosted vendor, because even if you get it set up right with their fairly rapid turnaround, it's like not everyone has the time to fully test and upgrade their entire Kubernetes infrastructure every 18 months, I believe it is. So
or sooner, right? Like you need to really be maintaining this.
Yeah, so Kubernetes is certainly hotness, but in my opinion, it's not quite ready for the masses that aren't ready to take on this thing. You have places that, we still have servers that we haven't upgraded in 2 or 3 years. They don't have the whole CI/CD workflow. It's like, let's look at Kubernetes. It's like, that's scary.
Well, you had like Spectre and Meltdown, and suddenly, everyone needed to do so many patches and upgrades, and it was a tremendous amount of work. And using a managed service, you get to offload some of that. But people are saying that Kubernetes is ready for production, but just a year or two ago, they had almost no security in place. They really were like leaving all of these bugs and vulnerabilities unpatched and unfixed. So I think they're getting there, but it's still a lot of work for, I wouldn't recommend it for a small company to do on their own. Yeah. Yes?
The last couple of Kubernetes versions have very much improved upon their security, and if you patch your stuff, it will improve a lot. Like a lot of the stuff that used to be open by default isn't open by default anymore, and a lot of the stuff that was in like super beta a year or two ago is like out now, so role-based access control and like node restrictions and other kinds of things are easier to implement now. The defaults could use a little work. And one thing about the CIS benchmarks is that they are mostly applicable to Kubernetes core. So if you're running it on, if you're just running native Kubernetes on your cluster and you're not either hosting it on some other cloud provider or, you know, putting any kind of add-ons or plugins or anything on there, if it is all just out of the box, the CIS benchmarks will apply perfectly. If it is not all out of the box, a lot of the CIS benchmarks won't apply, which is unfortunate because almost nobody runs Kubernetes entirely out of the box. And so that's one thing to watch out for if you're trying to do your configurations yourself.
Do you have any recommendations for people who have like smaller businesses or smaller, you know, startups, people who aren't inside the enterprise but want to do this?
Who want to run it, who want to secure
Yeah,
it?
like for people who are part of smaller teams who want to run Kubernetes, what would you suggest?
GCP is pretty good these days. They have some pretty good security things that are built into it. It's probably a decent idea to use some sort of thing that's bigger than you. There are startups that kind of do a lot of the security configuration for you. And so if you are a small business who don't want to deal with that yourself, like Aqua is really good for kube security. There are a couple of other ones. Capsulate's really good. And trying to go through a vendor in this case is actually probably a pretty good idea unless you have full-time people who are dedicated to this.
Aqua puts out some of the best security material, and the talks by folks at Aqua have been really good. I've been really impressed. I haven't played with their tools, but I appreciate your recommendation. Anyone else? Yes, please. Yes, like Aqua.
Like who?
Like Aqua.
So I recently launched a large company using GCP to make on-prem to the cloud, and Kubernetes was out of the box. There wasn't a discussion of security. So how do you go about managed services when they're not really providing that?
You have to be really...
The expert, right?
Right. Well, you need to choose managed services that are making security a priority, and then discuss that with them and make sure that your needs are met. I think that that's right, that security is on the back burner for a lot of the developers and then a lot of the people who are doing implementation and then even some of the managed services, and that's how you end up with the situation where I can go on Shodan and just see like so many Kubernetes instances just exposed publicly. I was friends with some folks at Aptable, which is part of how I got into containers, and they were building like hardened Docker containers, or they still are, for people who need to be HIPAA compliant, for startups that need to be HIPAA compliant. And so they do a whole range of things, including like managing the encryption and like duplicating the databases, and when Spectre and Meltdown happened, they dealt with all the patching. And so there are smaller providers that are really like security focused, and I think that that's useful. But ultimately, Kubernetes is starting to grow up, and it's within a very big, well-resourced company, namely Google. So I'm optimistic about the future, but I think it's important to push them a bit because they are going to focus on security more as they see that it matters and that it's getting attention. Yeah. Any other? Yes, please.
Yeah, do you have any experience with Pivotal, particularly Pivotal Container Service? They're pushing Kubernetes, and they're kind of saying as a default, we'll give you the most recent version of Kubernetes with extensions and everything.
Right.
So it's kind of like...
That's table stakes, though, you know, to be doing the most recent version. I think that that's good.
It's stable. the most recent.
Right, the most recent stable version. Pivotal is a good firm overall, but they're not necessarily security focused. And so you may end up with some trade-offs that you don't want if security is more important to you. I haven't played with Pivotal specifically, but I haven't seen them in any of my work or research in Kubernetes. Like I didn't see them at KubeCon. I'm not seeing their name come up when I'm reading like security papers, like Aqua keeps coming up. And Microsoft has a really big presence, and they're also security focused. I mean, you can say what you want about Microsoft, but like their enterprise security is like fairly stable, so I feel good about that. And their Kubernetes service also does like all the automatic updates, which is really important. So I think these services are good. If I were you and I was looking at Pivotal, I'd just see, does it like really meet my needs?
And I've used Cloud Foundry quite a bit, and they've just recently announced the container service, and just trying to learn,
Yeah.
apply some best practices.
Yeah, it's a lot to sort through.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for coming. Yes, please.
Did you say you looked at other orchestration, like easier integrated containers?
Yeah, I've been interested in orchestration tools. That's actually how I started to get into this.
Well, I wonder if they implement security better.
I think that the orchestration tools can be a really good security tool because you have a team that's working full time thinking about these issues and with like all the resources to put into it. But it's a question of knowing where you're at. If you have the resources and the time and the ability to do everything yourself, that's good, but that's not true for a lot of people and a lot of organizations, especially when crunch time hits. So that's the usefulness of these like managed platforms, is they're going to handle the upgrades and the patches and the encryption, and all of these things for you, but you're putting your trust in them, which is a challenging thing to do. So I think it's a question of vetting them carefully and like understanding how are they actually, like how are they doing the security for you? What are the features? Any other stories, your own experience? Anyone have experience just that you think is relevant to this? Anything you want to share? Yes, please.
I was just kind of looking at this thing about the intentional by default.
Yes.
Something that is, it's an industry, it's actually, in my time, it's like an industry part that's continuing to develop on itself. Look back to like Windows, like NT 2000, a lot of this great vulnerability for the fact that they're trying to keep previous versions.
That's right. The backwards compatibility is a big rabbit hole.
That too, and what the individual here said, rapid deployment, put it out the door.
Yeah.
And not having the necessary, say, template tools, like just to get something up to another failure, they should at least, they're going to have things on that call for rapid deployment, they should at least go, here's a template, it's not 100%, but it will get you limited, like your luck keyboard and this.
Right. I think what's challenging right now is that the information being put out by like Docker and Kubernetes and these organizations about how to be secure is just like really dense and not necessarily well prioritized, and just like above the capabilities of some of the groups that are putting things up there, combined with the fact that people assume that a product by Google is going to be like secure out of the box. I think I understand and respect why people would think the defaults would be appropriate.
I agree to disagree with like, okay, I'm not trying to sell this, but like, I use CentOS in my job environment, and I don't know how many people know, even though there's actually a little hidden switch port playing sticks that actually has some level. They're not, oh my god, the greatest, but they're a little outdated, but at least they can patch a lot of holes and you can go through like,
Right.
attacks, and so, like I said, it just seems like the industry's like repeating its failures.
Right.
Sitting back and go, okay, we need to stop banging our heads and all. We need to stop just chasing our tail.
We're in the early days of containers, and it's very similar to the early days of software, right? Like software eventually has become more secure. Of course, we have more attackers now. Containers will become more secure and perhaps more attackers. Yeah. Oh, I'm clearly not making an excuse.
I've been in security for years, decades, and it all goes back, we go back to the early 90s and early Windows crap that was out there. And we think, oh, we're going to do better, and we don't. And we have developers that bring out cool products, and we use them. When are we going to push back and say, you know, make it secure, or we're not going to use it?
I'm trying to shame them right here. I love trash.
I mean, we look at IoT, so IoT's been a big deal now in the hacking community for the last 5 years or so. It's the same thing. It's first to market, and we don't care about security. We're talking to business.
Yeah, but it's a mess.
And it is a mess. That's my point. We don't learn. So
Thank you.
for us, I mean, in the sense that it keeps our crops secure. We got all this crap that we have to deal with. But when are we going to learn? We're not. It's a relief cycle. We keep doing the same things. We put out cool tools
Yeah.
that are fantastic. Don't get me wrong. Containers are awesome.
Containers are very cool.
We will be accepted because as a business, our enterprises roll it out. It's not secure. And what do we do? We try to do what we can. We're here talking about it. How do you have to?
I saw you had your hand up before. Are you Ian? Is that right? Yeah.
For better or worse, and I think that there are lessons to be learned from this, Kubernetes originally did not really come with secure stuff out of the box because it did not believe when Kubernetes first came out, much actually probably in the early days of software, that Kubernetes would be run in production. And eventually, I'm serious, and eventually people were sort of caught by surprise that people were doing this in production, and people realized that they had to, start thinking in a way that would lend itself to development for pride. But before, people were just kind of playing with it, and I don't think it really occurred to people. And for the people in the room who are developers, there's probably lessons to be learned from this about thinking about how things will scale in the future when you're first starting your product. I had something else to say, but there were a lot of people talking about that.
Yeah.
I think it also goes back in a certain sense to, and you started this because it's always discussion, but it kind of goes back to universities. We don't teach software security like we should. And so we have cool people doing research at universities, companies, and elsewhere, and their focus isn't abstract. Their focus is what's cool.
Pablo?
So I think all sides are pointing the spear at the other side of the fence. So first of all, if it's open source and available for download, it is not a product that somebody is selling you, and it is probably not meant for production use. Universities don't produce products; they produce research. I just came with a faculty at the university. We did a lot of research, and we put it out there. Our standard disclaimer is: this is research. This is not meant to be used as a production tool. So if you're downloading this stuff for free and you're putting it in a production environment without taking a look at the code on your own, then frankly, shame on you.
So
Yeah, in the front.
the average enterprise app has
I see
something
that.
like 1,000 open source dependencies. So saying shame on them is nice, but it's not the reality of the world. The reality of the world is everybody has massive dependencies and software supply chain. And mostly free software that doesn't have any money to get tested. Sure.
In the back?
So Kubernetes originally came from Google, right? It got used internally in Google, and so it was working well for them, obviously. And then they open sourced it, like we did some stuff, and here you go. And then a lot of people that aren't Google don't have the resources of Google. Yes, let's run with it. And so inherently, like I said, this is a complex piece of software to get everything working the same way.
Yes, please.
One of the things that we're seeing, we've got a corporate security team that spent a year rolling out all this great blinky, here, spend money on stuff, on all these server-based systems, whether they were the cloud, whatever. We've got a business unit that's building out these great new products. Everything's done with Kubernetes. Our team knows what we're doing. The other team said, well, you have to install all this security stuff on your systems. And we're going, but it doesn't work. And they go, oh. And then they go back to the vendor, and the vendor goes, oh. It's comical. And they spend millions of dollars, and then they're kind of scratching their heads going, we didn't see this coming. We didn't plan for this. We didn't.
It's not just your team, it's the vendors.
That's what I'm saying. It is the vendors, and it's the corporate mindset of just spend money on something that we can then say to the board, we're all secure. What do you mean you're using some great new product over here that is going to make our life developing easier? That doesn't match with what we just spent money on. Huh?
In the back.
I can confirm. I'm working right now with they're like, we need to switch Kubernetes. And they're like, we need to run our vulnerability management on it. Their vuln scanner can't scan it.
Right.
We need to patch it. Their patch solution won't talk to it. And on and on and on. So I'm like, hey, you have no vulns? You have no patches. Don't worry about it. Safe.
Yeah. Yeah.
It must be absolutely fine. But the other thing that I thought was very interesting was the earlier comment made about dependencies. If you guys have seen the Sonatype report, it's frightening. Right leading up to when the Struts vulnerability hit, to when Metasploit had it, to when Equifax breach happened, all of that happened, right? And they trended out how many people were downloading this vulnerable version of Struts. I mean, it's on the freaking news that major companies are getting compromised. 80 to 100,000 downloads per month, no deviation during all of that. And one of the fundamental problems, I believe, is we do not give our developers and from the time they're in college to the time they're in the corporate environment, enough solid, secure frameworks to build off. Because I bet you what's happening is a bunch of people are following the framework, oh, app get struts. Okay, now I can build my app, and I'll put it in Kubernetes. You know? And so we've got all this vulnerable code that we just keep building on, and then by the time it gets to the enterprise space, we either ignore it. I'm doing an audit with an automotive company and say, DevOps is out of scope for this audit. Oh, okay, good. Everything must be secure. Or we can't do anything with it because our tools don't run.
And that is where the problem lies, because you've got DevOps on one side and the old world corporate security mentality of meet numbers, do this, we're all secure because we meet numbers, and therefore there's no problem. And that's what we're fighting against. And yes, we have the side that is using open source, and we're all tying into it, and it's great. But then the other side just wants to go, we don't know what to do.
Ian?
So one thing I was going to say, is that Kubernetes is an open source project, and so if there are people who are Linux experts who know about that SecCom, who know about like appropriate ways to like secure things in like Linux environments or things similar, please get involved in the Kubernetes security group. Like it's really needed. There aren't that many people on it. It can always use more work, and if like if you're at all interested in using the open source, like there is a lot of space for that in the space, and like that would be really awesome if we could get more security-minded people in here, because it's there just aren't that many people.
That's a great suggestion. It won't solve the problem of, at times, there are certain security implementations that they don't want to do, but it'll get more hands on deck. And it does look like they're expanding that group. I saw Hannah in the back.
Yeah, I was just going to say that one of the reasons why Kubernetes sort of a toy that turned into something real. And
Right.
yeah, and that's what ends up happening a lot in engineering, that you have this sort of toy appliance that becomes this real thing. Like VMware had Workstation that was a toy virtualization environment that became easier. So
Right. We're seeing, these very old, GitHub bugs getting closed, right? Like bugs from 2015 are getting closed now. And at KubeCon, which was just a few weeks ago, a lot of the talks were about security. And like people were saying that was the theme. Yeah.
All those talks are online.
Yes.
You go to YouTube and search for CNCF, Cloud Native Computing Foundation. Literally, they have like 1,000 of them, because they have this year's KubeCon, they have last year's KubeCon, and they have a lot of security talks.
Yeah, and the security's been evolving really quickly, so this year's talks are going to be the good ones, or in my opinion, the best ones to look at, because they're the most recent. And that was the theme. Like, people were talking about how that's the theme this year. So we're starting to realize that Kubernetes is being used in production, and people are starting to put more effort into security. But, in the meantime, there's still a lot there. You go on Showdown, there's a lot there. Yes?
So how about accountability? Something that I hear a lot is just, teams, especially from business and, solution teams, are constantly saying, oh, well, it's cloud, like Kubernetes does all that, and Docker handles all that for us. And so how do you communicate that accountability and say, you still have to do secure configuration, you still have to do patching, you mentioned vuln scanning, vuln scanning of images.
Right. How do you talk up inside your organization so they understand that the defaults aren't secure and that you need to put some work in, and that you're not just like being lazy or procrastinating, but there's more to do. I would probably, I'll see if I can get this up online, or like find me on Twitter. I can bring that back up. My Twitter handle is Elissabeth, ELISSABETH. And anyone can send me a DM or just tweet me there for questions that aren't fully handled here, because I can send you some links. There are sections where, the Google security blog for Kubernetes talks about all the things that you need to do. So I would go to some of these primary sources and just show them, like, look, we need to do all of this work to get the configuration to where it needs to be. And maybe you could show examples, like you could show how other companies are getting hacked and it's embarrassing. Right? Like Tesla got hacked and it was all over the news, and you don't want to be them. And that's like the motivation for putting that work in. But that's a hard question, right? It's always a hard question of how to get more time and resources to do security in your org.
Yeah, I hear commonly people say, well, it's AWS. AWS is everything for security. Well, no, you still have to configure your cloud from a hypervisor level up, and there's still a lot of security to put in.
Yeah, for your threat model, for whatever you're doing. Thank you. If there isn't anything else, at the end of the day, I'll be happy to, let all of you folks go, even though I keep you here all day. This is fun for me. Pablo's smiling. You're the one who's really in charge. That's true. Any other thoughts or questions? No? All right. Well, I'm going to hang out here. Anyone who wants to is welcome to hang out here and continue the conversation. But, it's the end of the day. If you want to get up and walk around and stretch so you have some energy for the parties and stuff later, I will not be offended. But someone comes up to me, hi, Michael. I haven't seen you in a while. Thanks for coming. Yeah.